Who's doing well, who's not doing well abroad?
Yeah, so it's actually an interesting situation because the internet companies like Facebook and Google parent company Alphabet, they do have a lot of users outside of the United States, but a significant share of their revenue continues to be generated inside the United States. And the issue here is that if you look at companies like Facebook and Google, they're generating most of their money from digital advertising. Microsoft is generating most of its money from selling technology to businesses, also a big market for Amazon. And in those two markets, digital advertising and business technology sales, the U.S. is by far the largest market in the world. And in e-commerce, China is number one, the U.S. is a distant number two. And as we well know, China has not been a hospitable e-commerce market or internet market for U.S. technology companies.
Now, why is Amazon so reliant on sales in the U.S., and is that a danger? Is that an Achilles heel?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So, to my surprise, Amazon has actually gotten more reliant on the U.S. in the last 5 years rather than less. And part of that is because of AWS and its success with all kinds of customers. Again, a large portion of that spending is in the U.S. But also U.S. or North America e-commerce sales are growing faster than e-commerce sales outside the U.S. for the last couple of years. And so now 69% of Amazon's total sales last year comes from the United States. So
But what about all the money that Amazon has been pouring into India and other international markets?
I think that's a lot about the future, that those are growth markets, but right now are relatively small.
So Apple, meantime, has been doing well abroad, despite, much of the concerns we've been talking about sales in China. Will Apple's future international growth be as strong?
It's hard to see that. So the issue for Apple is that the biggest smartphone growth markets are places like India and Vietnam, where Apple doesn't look like they're in a great position, right? That their prices are relatively high compared to other smartphone companies, and they haven't really shown a willingness to tailor those products for a particular country's needs. And so that puts them at a little bit of a disadvantage, at least as far as we can see so far, in places like India.
Now, when it comes to Google and Facebook, do you foresee that their reliance on the United States will ever change?
It's going to be, I don't think so, not in the short term. So again, the issue is the biggest pool of advertising is in the United States. Yes, that market is growing more slowly than some of the explosive advertising growth markets, including China. But the U.S. is still by far the largest market. And so those companies are positioned well for the future if and when you start seeing large advertising markets in the developing world getting bigger as a share of total global advertising. But again, China is kind of the big hole for them.
Right, they may never have access.
They may never be able to access China, and even if they are, they may never be successful there.
Now, I do want to get your thoughts on this new Amazon board member, Indra Nooyi, adding a fifth woman to Amazon's board. Of course, you remember the shareholder pushback about the lack of diversity on Amazon's board, and they've answered some of those protests. What do you make of the choice of Indra Nooyi?
Yeah, I mean, in addition to the board diversity issue, I think she's also, a really great addition to that board, given her long experience at PepsiCo. She, as a former consumer product company CEO, knows what the challenges are of being a traditional company that's trying to pivot to the e-commerce world. And so she has that perspective now as an Amazon board member.
Now, speaking more broadly, Amazon included, what do you see as the international financial picture of these U.S. tech companies, let's say in the next 5 years? How much actually changes?
It's hard to see it changing materially in the next 5 years. Amazon might be the exception, right? We could start seeing some of those outside the U.S. e-commerce markets like India really take off. But again, if you're dependent on advertising, or if you're Microsoft depending on business technology sales, the U.S. is still just this huge sponge of revenue for those companies to take advantage of. And I don't see that changing, even if, again, the majority of users for companies like Facebook and Google are not in the United States. It's still where the money is.
Outside of Apple, what are the U.S. tech companies, the other U.S. tech companies that are doing well abroad or getting a greater portion of their sales abroad?
Well, I mean, look, this is all relative. So both Facebook and Google are generating a little bit more than half of their revenue outside the United States. So that's, impressive. The hardware companies, the business technology hardware companies, have tended to do well in places like Europe. So if you think about IBM or Cisco or Oracle, those companies do well abroad, as do the chip companies. Companies like Intel and Qualcomm, right? Everybody needs computer chips, no matter what country you're in. So those companies are well positioned. But if you look at, again, the giant internet companies and e-commerce companies, it's a little bit of a harder sell outside the United States, at least in terms of their finances.
Now, international growth considered, I mean, you and I have been talking over the last several weeks and months about Techlash, the sort of backlash against U.S. consumer tech companies. I mean, all of these companies have lost, hundreds of billions of dollars in market cap value over the last several months. Do you expect them to recover that over this year, or are we at a new normal?
Well, I think you have seen some of the stock prices of the giant internet companies come back from that swoon that we saw starting in September, October last year. So there certainly has been a recovery. But I think that what we've seen in terms of this backlash to big technology companies, that is a permanent fixture of life for these companies now. It doesn't necessarily mean that their market value is going to crater or going to go to zero, but it does mean that this is now the #1 risk factor for every big technology company, is this kind of increasing risk of regulatory pushback or user anxiety or user defection as a result of their size, power, missteps, involvement in election manipulation, and things like that.